Prakriya 5. All objects point to consciousness. Existence has the chair. In the witness Prakriya, a sadhaka approaches the sat, or existence aspect of the self. Body, sense, and mind are seen as changing appearances, illuminated by a changeless witness that keeps staying always present, standing unaffected at the inmost center of experience. That is the real self, beneath its fitful and changing appearances and personality. Standing back in it, as the witness, all objects seen are taken back into its unmixed consciousness. There, they are utterly dissolved, together with their witnessing in non-duality. Instead of this drawing back, there is a further prakriya, which goes forward, into confrontation with apparent objects. This further prakriya investigates how anyone can know what objects truly are. It proceeds through the chit, or consciousness aspect of self, to determine what is sat, or existence in the world. First, as in the witness prakriya, all gross experience of outside objects are reduced to the more subtle experiences of our conceiving minds. We think of objects in a world that's outside consciousness, but this is just imagination in our minds. In actual fact, no one ever can experience any objects outside consciousness. In anyone's experience, consciousness is always there, together with each object that appears. Each object is experienced as a perception, or a thought, or a feeling, in the presence of consciousness. Each object shows that knowing presence, but then what else does an object show as it appears? When some object is perceived, it shows perception. When it is thought about, what it shows is thought. When it is felt, what's shown is feeling. Our minds imagine that their perceptions, thoughts, and feelings somehow go outside of consciousness, to an external world, but this never actually happens. No perception, thought, or feeling can actually leave consciousness and go outside. When any such appearance goes out of consciousness, the appearance disappears immediately. Each perception, thought, and feeling always stays in consciousness until it disappears. It never does show anything outside, as actually experienced. So what gets shown is always consciousness, and only that. Nothing else is ever shown in anyone's experience. Consciousness has no outside. Though we imagine that outside, things come into it, and therefore make it different from what it was before. This is never true, in fact. Consciousness is never influenced or changed in any way that makes a real difference to it. When anything appears, it seems that something has been added on to consciousness so as to make a difference. But again, this difference is false imagination in the mind. In actual fact, the difference is unreal. What appears is nothing else but consciousness, and therefore nothing has, in truth, been added on. When an appearance disappears, it seems that something has been taken away from consciousness, and this again appears to make a difference. But the difference is unreal. Since the appearance did not actually add anything, its disappearance cannot, then in truth, take anything away. In short, whatever objects may appear, what it shows is only consciousness as its sole reality, and that reality is always the same, always unchanged, as it is shown by all objects that anyone perceives or thinks about or feels. That consciousness is always present throughout experience, as the complete reality of all physical and mental objects that appear in the entire universe. Our minds and bodies make a changing show of partial objects that appear perceived, or thought about, or felt. But throughout this made-up show of partial things, consciousness knows all existence as itself. In that complete existence, each object is contained. Sri Atmananda had a special way of pointing out how that existence gets to be understood. Habitually, we think of existence as something that belongs to objects. For example, having seen a chair and touched it and sat in it, a person may say, "This chair exists." At first, there seems to be nothing wrong with such a statement, but it does have a problem. It puts the chair first, and thus it speaks of existence as something that is possessed by the chair. It says, in effect, the chair has existence. What then is this existence that belongs to the chair? It is something that appears only in some part of space and time. Elsewhere, outside this particular location, the chair's existence disappears. Thus, it turns out that the chair's existence is no more than a partial appearance of some further and truer existence that is more complete. When we think that a chair has existence, we are not speaking with full truth. To speak more truly, it would be more accurate to say, existence has the chair. For existence to be fully true, all objects that appear, physical or mental, must belong to it. They must all be its appearances. That is existence in itself, known truly as identical with consciousness, to which all objects point. How does this Prakriya relate to traditional approaches? An illustration is given by Sri Atmananda in one of his tape-recorded talks, the talk called Sahaja in the book Atmananda Tattva Samhita. Here, Sri Atmananda recounts an incident that occurred toward the end of his sadhana period, which included a yogic training in some traditional samadhis. In particular, he had come to practice a jnana-oriented samadhi, repetitively thinking, with increasing intensity, that he was neither body nor senses nor mind, but only pure consciousness. One day, while he was thus proceeding towards samadhi, a disturbance came in from a horse-drawn cart, which was going on by the roadside. As the irritating noise came in, it made him think that he should move somewhere else and get away from the distraction. But then it suddenly occurred to him that even the irritation was a means of pointing to that same consciousness in which he wished to be established. As Sri Atmananda goes on to say, once it is realized that every object points to consciousness, then nothing can be a disturbance that distracts from truth. Thereby all seeming obstacles are converted into aids that help to realize what's true. Accordingly, this Prakriya leads on to the Sahaja, or the natural, state of settled spontaneity established always in plain truth. 5a. The practice of inquiry. Religious and yogic exercises have long been used as a personal and cosmic preparation, purifying personal motives and expanding cosmic views, in order to prepare for an eventual inquiry into impartial truth. In the end, that inquiry must leave behind all personal development and the entire cosmos as it is seen through body and through mind. Like Ramana Maharshi, Sri Atmananda laid emphasis upon the inquiry itself. In particular, he taught prakriyas that do not need the use of religious worship or of yogic meditation, and he encouraged many of his disciples to focus on these prakriyas. To the exclusion of both religious and yogic exercise. He told these disciples that this would be their most direct way to truth. This was not said as a concession to Westerners. It was said for everyone, Indians and Westerners and others alike, in the changed circumstances of the modern world. Unfortunately, there is a prevalent misconception that religious worship and such meditative practices exercises are essential to put the theory of Advaita into practice, and this misconception is not Indian in particular. It is even more prevalent in the West, as old religious ways and meditations are returning back into fashion after a long period of repression and neglect. But as both Ramana Maharshi and Sri Atmananda said very clearly, the direct practice of Advaita isn't character development through worship or some meditative exercise. The direct practice is inquiry. What then takes the inquiry from theoretical imagining and postulation into actual practice? That doesn't happen just by following religious or yogic prescriptions. Instead, inquiry gets practical when it turns genuinely back, when it is one's own belief and assumptions that are genuinely in question. It's only by unseating one's own prejudiced and preconceived beliefs that questioning can come to a clearer truth. That unseating puts the theory into practical effect, and it depends on truth, for love, to give up cherished falsities upon which the ego keeps taking its self-conflated and deluding stand. There is nothing new about such genuine inquiry. It always has been there, refreshed with every generation, and it continues there today, refreshed in current circumstance. But it does need to be distinguished from the personal preparations that lead up to it, but which must be left behind. It's only for the special purpose of this distinction that Sri Atmananda spoke of religious and yogic practices as traditional. He wasn't saying that tradition and inquiry are fundamentally opposed. Far from it, he regarded reflective inquiry as the essential and indispensable basis of tradition, while religious and yogic practices are dispensable preparations at the changing surface, along with merely theoretical ideas. In particular, the story he recounted was one of being disturbed while withdrawing into samadhi, and suddenly realizing that the very purpose of samadhi would be better served by facing the disturbance. He was telling his disciples that, yes, he had practiced a kind of withdrawal, but he had found it quite unnecessary. Instead of using the statement, "I am pure consciousness," to enforce a withdrawal into nirvikalpi, or mindless state, he had found that he could do better by directly understanding what that statement means. Its meaning is directly shown by every object that appears, including all objects from which the mind withdraws in samadhi. By investigating ordinary experience, it is far more practical to see that each object points to consciousness, so that there is no need to withdraw from it. But the practice now is not a formal exercise of getting thrown into a special state. It is instead a spirit of questioning that faces things for what they are and asks exactly what they show, beneath all seeming make-belief that is not tested properly. Ramana Maharshi's last instruction is sometimes said to be, "Put the teaching into practice." The instruction is quite simple, and few would disagree with what it says. But since the very practice is inquiry, it does throw up a practical question of what exactly practice means. It's rather differently interpreted, not just in theory, but very much in practice, by different sadhakas. Question. You say, no perception, thought, or feeling can actually leave consciousness and go outside. When any such appearance goes out of consciousness, the appearance disappears immediately. Surely all you are doing is saying what the words mean. To perceive something means to be conscious of a precept. To think something means to be conscious of a thought. To feel something means to be conscious of a feeling. Thus it is part of the definition of these words that they are associated with consciousness. If a thought goes out of consciousness, then the appearance does indeed disappear. But is this not simply that it is no longer a thought, by definition, if we are not conscious of it? So all that this shows, by a dictionary definition, there are no precepts, thoughts, or feelings outside of consciousness, and nothing else is ever shown in anyone's experience, because no one sees anything without being conscious, back to where we started. Answer. The attempt is to say only what words mean, and to come back to where we started. The drift of the argument is simply this. Though we imagine that a world outside is perceived and thought about and felt, this never actually happens. All perceptions, thoughts, and feelings always stay in consciousness, and so they cannot really show anything outside. As you say, from the very beginning of these words we use, it is quite clear that nothing else but consciousness is ever shown. So whatever our minds may imagine, we are always back in consciousness, from where we started imagining. This imagination makes us think that we have gone somewhere else and seen something else, and that we come back and bring things in. But none of this ever happens, actually. We are always back where we started, and even the starting is false imagination. There never is any going out. There never is any going anywhere, nor coming back again. The amazing thing is that this is so obvious in the meaning of the words, as you point out. The very meaning of the words we use completely contradicts the description that we make of a physical and mental world. And yet, when this is pointed out, the first reaction is to dismiss it as too obvious and too trivial. Yes, indeed, the contradiction is obvious, and if one does not seriously consider its consequences and the question that it raises, then it stays trivial. It is then just a curiosity of language, a theoretical anomaly, of no genuine importance. Then of course one needs mystical and religious experience to make one take it seriously. But according to the Advaita tradition, if this contradiction is properly considered, following its questions through to their final end, then the question alone is enough to find whatever there is to be found, to realize plain truth beyond all compromise. Of course, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. Question. I also had the same problem with the question of existence. You said, the chair has existence. What then is this existence that belongs to the chair? It is something that appears only in some part of space and time. Elsewhere outside this one particular location, the chair's existence disappears. Again, is this not in fact what the word means? Part of the definition of the verb to exist, given my own online Oxford English Dictionary, is this: to be found, especially in a particular place or situation. Also, isn't existence an attribute in its normal usage? I might say that my coffee has blackness, but I wouldn't go on to suggest that blackness belongs to the coffee. I'm afraid I did not follow the last parts at all. Why, to speak more truly, it would be more accurate to say existence has the chair. What do you mean by talking about existence being fully true? Again, I'm happy with the conclusion, in theory at least, that nothing can be a disturbance because all points to truth. It's just I don't quite see how this follows from what has gone before. Answer. The attempt is only to examine what the word exist means, and neither dictionary definitions nor normal usage are beyond question. The dictionary definition suggests that there are two meanings, one that to exist is to be found in general, and the other that is to be found in a particular place or situation. The dictionary favors the particular existence, but an Advaita inquiry is not to be settled by some words in a book. It can only be settled by a strictly logical examination of direct experience. and the examination has to be uncompromising in the extreme. To settle the inquiry, no less is needed than a living truth, beyond all our habitual compromise with partial truths that have some killing or confusing element of falsity mixed in. The word existence most definitely describes something that stands, and stands in its own right. It implies a common and independent reality seen through different appearances. It's the appearances that come and go, as to what is seen from changing points of view. What exists remains, independent of how it is seen. When something called existence is found to appear and disappear, then that contradicts the meaning of the word. It means that the word existence is mistakenly used for something that doesn't really exist. Take the so-called existence of a particular chair. Since it appears at some place in time, but disappears at others, it does not in truth exist. We speak of it loosely as existing because it is common to some different views that we see when looking at some part of space and time from different locations. Each view is partial. It shows something about the chair, but not everything. But the chair in turn is a partial view of something bigger which contains it. If we think of the whole house in which the chair is contained, then the chair is a partial appearance that we get of the whole existence of the house. This is a partial appearance that we see by looking restrictedly at the particular location of the chair. The same consideration would in turn apply to the house. In the end, the word existence can't be used with full accuracy unless it applies to all there is. It can only properly apply to a complete existence in which all objects are contained. Only that complete existence can be fully true, without any undermining taint of some compromise with falsity. When that complete existence is identified as consciousness, then every object points to it. Every object shows the knowing presence of pure consciousness, and it thus helps a sadhaka to see what's truly there. It's only in the seeming world that one object may distract attention from another, and only then is the distracting object a disturbance that gets in the way of perceiving other things. But when impartial truth is sought, there can be no real disturbance. Anything that seems to disturb is only announcing its reality, which is pure consciousness. The greater the disturbance seems, the louder it announces that impartial truth. When that is understood, all seeming obstacles are realized as helpful means to find what's true, and to become established there. It is, admittedly, a funny sort of paradox seen from the world's confusions. Sri Atmananda made a delicate distinction between the witness and the real self, called kutastha, or atma. The witness is not consciousness itself, or atma itself. Instead, the witness is the last staging post on the way to realizing self. The truth of self is found by clarifying ego's confusion, which falsely mixes up the knowing self with known acts of personality. To clear the confusion, the self that knows must be discerned completely from anything that's known as a differentiated object or a changing act. Through a clear and impartial discernment, there must be a full completion of this duality between the knowing subject and its known objects or acts, so that no trace remains of any mixing up between the two. As the duality becomes complete, the witness stand is reached. Viewed from ego in the world, the last remaining trance of confused duality remains in the idea of the witness. There still remains a witnessing of changing activities that show up in the mind, and despite all intellectual arguments to the contrary, the witnessing still looks a little like one of those changing activities, as it illuminates appearances and records what it has lit. However, when the witness concept has been fully followed through to where it points, it is no longer an idea, but an actual stand. And then, immediately, the stand is actually reached. The idea of the witness gets dissolved, without a trace of duality remaining there. Accordingly, the witness is a completion of duality that straightaway gives itself up to non-duality. When fully understood, the witness concept thus dissolves itself, of its own accord, in that non-dual truth of self, which is also called by other such names like consciousness and kutastha. Literally, kutastha means standing at the topmost peak. Kuta meaning topmost, peak, and stha meaning standing. So I would like to make the following interpretation of stanzas from the Bhagavad Gita. Here, in this world, there are two principles of life, one changing, while the other stays unchanged. All beings that have come to be get changed. The changeless is called kutastha, found standing at the topmost peak. As I transcend all change, and even that which does not change, I am often called the highest principle, both in the Vedas and the world. Whoever knows me unconfused, just as the highest principle, joins into me entirely, with heart and mind completely merged. 15:16 through 19. In the first stanza, 15:16, the name Kutastha is associated with the changeless witness, thus indicating that it is the highest standpoint of experience in the world. The next stanza, 15:17, suggests an I that is even bigger, beyond the world entirely. And the last stanza, 15:18, tells of a complete dissolution into that final truth of self, simply by knowing unconfused. According to Sri Atmananda, that unconfused knowing is attained immediately when the witness stand is actually reached. There, dissolution in the real self is immediate and spontaneous, requiring no further thought or effort. In other words, when reaching the topmost height of the witness standpoint, it immediately dissolves its seeming separateness as a distinct peak or point, as it merges itself into non-duality. So yes, there does seem to be a slight difference of terminology between the Bhagavad Gita and Advaitins like Sri Atmananda in the use of the term Kutastha, but the difference is very slight, having to do with the delicate distinction between witness and self. Advaitins like Sri Atmananda tend to use the word Kutastha as it occurs in the Ashtavaraka Samhita. Release yourself from the delusions, I am this apparent person who has somehow come to be, perceived outside or felt within. Thus recognize yourself as that true individuality, which stands above all seeming else as unconditioned consciousness, unclouded by duality. 1.13. Here Kutastha is clearly not just the witness, but consciousness itself, or non-dual self, which is the only true individuality.